I stepped onto my ranch after months away, expecting peace, fresh air, and the quiet rhythm of life I'd built. Instead, I found a letter on the front gate, official looking and terrifying. The HOA had given me 24 hours to tear down everything I'd worked for. My home, my property, my sanctuary. My jaw tightened as I read the words, my heart racing. They didn't just want compliance, they wanted control, and they thought fear could make me obey. But I wasn't about to let them dictate my life. The question was, how far would I go to fight back? And what would I make them pay? Before the conflict, life on my ranch was simple, quiet, and everything I had worked for. Nestled on a sprawling property at the edge of town, my home was surrounded by rolling pastures, grazing cattle, and the occasional dirt road that twisted through open fields. The mornings smelled of fresh hay and dew, the air crisp and unhurried, and I could spend hours walking the land, inspecting fences, checking gates, or just watching the sun rise over the horizon. It was my sanctuary, the place where work and freedom intertwined, and where every corner of the property reflected years of effort, sweat, and pride. Neighbors were few but familiar. Most were distant ranchers or retirees, polite but uninvolved in anything beyond a nod on passing. Life was slow, predictable, and the kind of peace I had come to cherish after years of hectic city life. I maintained the land carefully, repaired every fence post, painted every trim, and ensured my property remained beautiful yet functional. There were no complaints, no disruptions, no unnecessary attention, until the HOA became involved. It started subtly. A letter here, a notice there, couched in polite language but dripping with authority. They claimed rules had been violated, codes ignored, standards unmet. Everything from fence height to paint color, even though the ranch had existed long before the HOA's arbitrary guidelines. At first, I ignored it. My ranch, my property, my rules. But the warnings escalated. Notices arrived more frequently, each one more demanding than the last, sometimes threatening fines or legal action. I began to feel the walls closing in. The quiet life I had built suddenly overshadowed by distant bureaucrats who had never set foot on my property, who seemed determined to control every inch of land I called my own. The tension lingered like a shadow over every morning. Simple tasks, inspecting cattle, maintaining equipment, or fixing a leaky gate, became charged with anxiety. I would check the mailbox, waiting for the next veiled threat, and every knock on the door, every passing car, made me flinch. Friends noticed my unease, and asked if everything was okay, but I couldn't explain fully. It wasn't just about rules or fines. It was about power, authority, and the audacity of strangers trying to dictate the life I had earned. I began to notice other signs of interference, an unfamiliar truck parked along the edge of my property. The distant murmur of voices when I knew no one should be around. Subtle comments from neighbors who seemed to have absorbed the HOA's version of the story. The small community that had once felt neutral now seemed divided, eyes and whispers quietly assessing me and my property. It was clear the HOA wasn't satisfied with letters or fines. They wanted compliance, they wanted control, and they believed intimidation was enough to force it. That's when I realized the stakes were far higher than a fence, a color choice, or a piece of land. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were challenging my autonomy, testing my patience, and daring me to respond. And I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't let them win. Every preparation, every careful repair, every quiet moment on my ranch became a silent affirmation: this was mine, and no arbitrary authority would take it without a fight. Little did I know, the letters would escalate into a single ultimatum that would change everything, tear down my ranch within 24 hours, or face consequences I couldn't ignore. The countdown had begun, and the storm I had long anticipated was about to break. The days following the ultimatum became a relentless blur of tension, anxiety, and the slow, burning fire of determination as the HOA's presence, once abstract and distant, transformed into a constant shadow over every inch of my ranch. Letters arrived with increasing frequency, each one more absurd, more petty, more brazen than the last, citing rules that were contradictory, obscure, or outright impossible to follow. From fence height regulations that didn't exist when my property was established, to color codes for buildings that had stood for decades, all couched in legalese designed to intimidate. And every time I opened the mailbox, a surge of anger and disbelief ran through me, mingled with the frustration of knowing that they had no authority to dictate my life, yet wielded the illusion of power like a weapon. The psychological warfare escalated, each notice accompanied by veiled threats of fines, liens, or court action, creating a sense that no matter what I did, it would never be enough, that the very act of breathing on my own land could be construed as defiance. And this creeping pressure turned routine maintenance into a minefield of anxiety, forcing me to triple check every measurement, every paint touch-up, every repair, knowing that even minor imperfections could be seized upon as evidence of violation. Then came the ground intimidation, subtle at first, a nondescript truck parked along the edge of my property, tires crunching gravel whenever I approached the gate, figures lingering in the distance who vanished when I looked directly at them, and whispers among neighbors that I hadn't heard before, rumors clearly seeded by the HOA, spreading unease and isolation, creating a sense that my sanctuary was no longer mine alone, that every corner of my land had become a stage for surveillance and judgment, and the once peaceful mornings of sunlight and dew now felt heavy with tension and anticipation. I tried to reason with them, responding politely to letters, documenting everything meticulously, consulting local regulations, and even reaching out to neighboring property owners for advice, but each step toward compliance only seemed to embolden their audacity, as if my effort to cooperate was evidence of weakness. And the pressure intensified when they began sending inspectors, unannounced visits framed as routine checks, yet clearly designed to catch minor issues and escalate the conflict, leaving me feeling constantly watched, like every move was being scrutinized, every action second-guessed, and the growing sense of helplessness gnawed at my nerves, but also fueled a simmering determination that I refused to let them win. The tension reached a fever pitch one afternoon, when a group of HOA representatives appeared at the driveway, badges and official-looking credentials in hand, and demanded immediate access to inspect the property, speaking in clipped, authoritarian tones that left no room for discussion, insisting that failure to comply could result in instant fines and legal action. And as they advanced, my pulse quickened, the air thick with the unspoken challenge of power, yet I refused to cede ground, standing firm, documenting every interaction, aware that any misstep could be twisted into evidence against me, but also realizing that this confrontation was the exact escalation I had anticipated, the moment where their bluff would either be called or I would be forced into submission. Every day after that brought a new wave of harassment. Letters doubling fines on minor infractions, phone calls filled with threats of court hearings, neighbors suddenly reporting violations I hadn't committed, and subtle sabotage like gates left unlocked or markers moved, all designed to provoke mistakes and fear. and each incident only strengthened my resolve, transforming frustration into strategy, anger into meticulous preparation, as I began mapping out every interaction, reviewing statutes, and planning contingencies, understanding that the looming 24-hour ultimatum to tear down the ranch was not just a threat, but a test of endurance, patience, and the ability to assert my rights under pressure. Nights were restless, sleep punctuated by anxious thoughts about the property, the escalating notices, and the looming deadline. But in those quiet hours, I also planned my countermeasures, envisioning every possible scenario, every response, and every leverage point I could exploit, and the line between fear and anticipation blurred, the challenge morphing into an opportunity to turn the tables. Then came the day the HOA crossed an invisible boundary, sending a team to my property under the guise of emergency compliance checks, their vehicles blocking the driveway, their presence aggressive and intimidating, as if they expected me to cower, and for a moment, I felt the surge of adrenaline that comes when personal autonomy is threatened. But I steadied myself, reminding myself that preparation and resolve were my greatest allies, and that any overreach they attempted would be documented and exposed. Every moment of this escalation built tension like a pressure cooker, each letter, visit, fine, and rumor adding weight, layering the conflict with frustration, disbelief, and mounting anticipation for the inevitable confrontation. And as the clock ticked closer to the 24-hour deadline, I realized that this wasn't merely about fences, paint, or property lines. It was a battle over respect, authority, and the right to control my own life, a battle they had initiated, and now, unknowingly, they were marching straight into the trap I had been laying all along. Every escalation, every petty harassment, every veiled threat feeding the strategy that would turn their audacity against them, leaving them exposed, powerless, and ultimately paying the price for the arrogance of assuming they could dictate the terms of my life. And as the sun set on the eve of the final deadline, I stood on my porch, surveying the ranch, every fence post, every building, every corner that bore my care and sweat, knowing that the storm was about to break, that months of harassment, intimidation, and absurdity were about to culminate in a confrontation that would not only settle the score, but redefine the balance of power, leaving everyone who had doubted me, neighbors, HOA representatives, and anyone who had ever underestimated the resolve of someone defending their home, with a lesson they would never forget. And the question lingered in the air. When the final hour arrived, would they back down, or would their arrogance finally meet the consequences they had earned? The morning of the final confrontation arrived with a strange, electric stillness, the kind that makes the air feel heavier, each sound sharper, as if the world itself were holding its breath in anticipation. And I knew that everything, months of harassment, intimidation, and petty threats, was about to converge in a single, decisive moment. The 24-hour deadline the HOA had imposed loomed like a ticking time bomb over my ranch, and I had spent every waking hour preparing, documenting, and strategizing, knowing that their audacity had finally reached the point of no return, that they were about to discover the consequences of assuming authority where none existed. As I stepped onto the porch, surveying my property, every fence post, every barn, every corner of land painstakingly maintained and deeply cherished, I saw their vehicles approaching in the distance, dark silhouettes against the horizon, moving with a confidence born of arrogance and the false sense of power that their letters, fines, and warnings had tried to cultivate, and I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, That tight coil of tension and focus that only comes when a direct challenge is unavoidable. They reached the driveway. The HOA representatives emerging in pairs, badges glinting, hands brushing against the edges of pockets that might or might not hold weapons. Their eyes scanning the property with condescension and expectation, as if my silence and compliance were inevitable, as if they owned not just the authority to enforce their imaginary rules, but also the audacity to walk onto my land and intimidate me into submission. I stood firm, each breath deliberate, my body radiating calm determination, the documentation and evidence of their harassment carefully displayed in my mind, like a blueprint, ready to turn every overreach into proof of their abuse, ready to expose them publicly and legally for the audacity they had shown. And, as they approached the fence, I could feel the tension stretch across the air, like a live wire, each second laden with potential violence, humiliation, or vindication. And I knew that this was the turning point, the moment where the months of psychological warfare would either break me or break them. One of the representatives stepped forward. Voice sharp, demanding immediate access, claiming urgent inspections and threatening fines, liens, and court action if I did not comply. And for a heartbeat, I felt the old twinge of fear, the instinctual reaction that comes when someone tries to usurp control over your life, your home, your property. But it was fleeting, replaced instantly by a surge of clarity and resolve, because I had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it, and understood that their arrogance had made them vulnerable. That every misstep, every bluff, every petty attempt at intimidation could be turned against them if approached correctly, with measured steps. I advanced to meet them at the edge of the property, maintaining calm, projecting authority, letting them feel that their confidence was unfounded. And as I reached the midpoint of the driveway, I began systematically presenting evidence of every overreach: letters, notices, photographs, recordings, each one demonstrating not compliance but harassment, not rules but power abuse. And their faces, once confident, began to flicker with doubt, confusion, and the dawning realization that they had underestimated not just me, but the extent of their own exposure. I explained, silently but with unmistakable presence, that any further attempt to intimidate, trespass, or coerce would not only be legally actionable but also publicly documented, the combination of preparedness, evidence, and resolve making clear that their bluff had been called, that their authority was hollow, and that their assumed power had reached the limits of reality. The tension became almost unbearable, a charged silence filled with unsaid words, racing thoughts, and the weight of consequences. As the HOA representatives glanced at one another, their previous swagger replaced by hesitation, each micro-expression betraying the understanding that they had crossed a line, that their campaign of intimidation had provoked a response far beyond what they had anticipated. And in that silence, I felt the culmination of months of preparation, the hours of documentation, the frustration transformed into strategy, coalescing into the decisive moment where control shifted unmistakably, slowly, deliberately. I signaled that they must leave, maintaining eye contact, posture unwavering, the sun glinting off evidence I had carefully arranged, the fence, the property, the cameras, all silent witnesses to the shift in power. And they began to retreat, their movements cautious, glances over shoulders betraying fear of exposure. The arrogance that had carried them so far now, replaced by a reluctant recognition that they were vulnerable, exposed, and powerless against someone who had taken the time to anticipate, prepare, and act with precision. Even as their vehicles disappeared down the driveway, The air seemed charged with the weight of what had transpired. The psychological victory undeniable, the humiliation they felt tempered by the fact that their entire campaign of control had been dismantled by the simple but powerful combination of calm, strategy, and unwavering assertion of rights. And as I stood there, surveying my ranch, the sun low and warm on the horizon, I realized that the confrontation was not just a personal victory, but a public lesson. Authority cannot be faked. Intimidation cannot be sustained when met with preparation, and those who assume power without legitimacy will always encounter consequences. Yet even in triumph, the story was far from over. The echoes of the confrontation reverberating through the neighborhood, whispers spreading among neighbors and former enforcers alike, creating a ripple of awareness that this ranch, my property, my sanctuary, would no longer be a target for arbitrary rules or petty threats. And the final thought that lingered as I lowered my arms and allowed myself a brief, steadying breath was the cliffhanger that would carry forward into the aftermath. They had been forced to retreat, but would they return, emboldened by spite, or would the lesson of preparedness, resolve, and righteous defiance leave a permanent mark on both the HOA and anyone foolish enough to challenge the rights of a determined homeowner? In the aftermath of that intense confrontation, a strange mixture of relief, satisfaction, and lingering tension settled over my ranch, as if the land itself was exhaling after months of stress, and the first days were quiet but charged with a new reality. The HOA, once a looming, omnipresent force, dictating absurd rules and sending menacing letters, had been forced to retreat, their authority shattered, not through anger or rash action, but through careful preparation, strategic documentation, and the unyielding assertion of my rights. And the ripple effects were immediate and unmistakable. Neighbors, who had quietly observed the escalating drama, began approaching cautiously, offering apologies for whispers or subtle interference, confessing that many had feared getting involved. And yet now, emboldened by the outcome, they acknowledged the courage and foresight required to stand firm against an organization that had tried to strip me of autonomy over my own property. And I realized that my stand had done more than preserve my ranch. It had sent a clear message that arbitrary power could be challenged, that intimidation without legitimacy was not only hollow but dangerous to those who wield it. As the weeks unfolded, correspondence from the HOA slowed to a trickle. Notices were rescinded, fines were dropped, and the very structure of the HOA began to show cracks, as members debated privately about accountability, authority, and the public embarrassment that had unfolded. And even those who had once whispered against me now treated me with cautious respect, the dynamic of the neighborhood shifting subtly but irrevocably, establishing a precedent that would echo far beyond my property lines. Meanwhile, I invested time in reinforcing my land, repairing fences, repainting structures, and installing additional documentation measures, knowing that preparation was a form of empowerment, and that vigilance was necessary even in victory. And each sunrise over the pastures felt heavier with meaning, not just as a routine beginning to a day, but as a symbol of regained control, resilience, and the rewards of patience under pressure. The legal ramifications slowly came into focus as well. I consulted with attorneys to ensure the HOA could not attempt similar tactics in the future, reviewing local property laws, past precedents, and municipal codes. And the knowledge that I had created an airtight record of their harassment provided a sense of security and psychological closure, allowing me to reclaim not just my ranch but my sense of sovereignty and dignity, reinforcing the lesson that preparation, documentation, and calm assertiveness are often the sharpest tools against overreach. Socially, the fallout was fascinating. Some neighbors who had quietly supported the HOA or feared confrontation shifted their allegiances, not necessarily out of admiration, but from recognition of the shifting balance of power, and slowly, a culture of accountability began to replace fear. As the story of the 24-hour ultimatum and its audacious countermeasure spread, not through gossip, but as a cautionary tale about the limits of authority and the consequences of overstepping bounds, and even in casual conversations at the local general store or coffee shop, people referenced the stand I had taken, noting how a single determined homeowner had turned the tables on a bureaucratic machine designed to intimidate, which was both humbling and affirming, a reminder that individual action, when strategic and deliberate, can redefine norms and expectations. Emotionally, the resolution was profound. Months of stress, anxiety, and sleepless nights gave way to a sense of empowerment and clarity, the kind that comes only after surviving a test of patience, courage, and ingenuity. And while the confrontation itself had been intense, it had also provided insight into human behavior, the fragility of assumed authority, and the unexpected ways in which overreach can backfire. And I found myself reflecting not only on the technicalities of property law, HOA codes, and compliance strategies, but also on resilience, personal boundaries, and the necessity of standing up for what is right even when the odds feel overwhelming. The tangible consequences were also clear. My ranch remained intact, untouched by demolition or forced modification. My investments in time, effort, and money were preserved, and I had created a protective buffer against future threats, both legal and social. With a record that could not easily be disputed, while the HOA itself faced scrutiny from higher authorities and community members questioning their methods, leading to internal debates, resignations, and policy reviews, all of which underscored the long-term impact of holding power to account and asserting one's rights with intelligence and composure. Psychologically, the victory reshaped my relationship with my property and the broader neighborhood. Every walk along the fence line, every inspection of barns and gates, every glance over rolling pastures carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had endured pressure, analyzed the stakes, and acted decisively at the pivotal moment. And I realized that the ranch was no longer just a home or a livelihood. It had become a symbol of resistance, strategy, and earned authority, a daily reminder that standing firm under threat can produce not only immediate results, but lasting influence, altering how others perceive both the property and the person who defends it. In practical terms, I implemented small changes to fortify the ranch's defenses and maintain autonomy, from reinforced gates to updated surveillance measures. But the most powerful reinforcement was the psychological barrier created by the confrontation, the understanding that those who try to intimidate without legitimacy are vulnerable to exposure, accountability, and consequences, and that preparation, patience, and strategic assertiveness often outweigh brute force or bureaucratic muscle. A lesson reinforced every time a letter arrives or a neighbor hesitates before overstepping bounds, knowing the precedent has already been set. Over time, the narrative of my stand spread beyond the immediate community, becoming a story cited in discussions about HOA overreach, property rights, and personal sovereignty, inspiring others to consider their options, legal protections, and the ways in which thoughtful, measured resistance can shift the balance of power. And it became clear that the impact of those 24 hours, the ultimatum that had seemed so threatening, extended far beyond the initial threat. leaving an indelible mark on both the physical property and the social landscape, transforming fear into empowerment, frustration into strategy, and harassment into an opportunity for lasting change. Reflecting on the experience, the ultimate takeaway: crystallized authority, whether bureaucratic, social, or institutional, is not absolute, and while intimidation may appear effective, it is fragile in the face of preparation, courage, and strategic action. And for anyone who has ever felt powerless in the face of arbitrary rules or overreaching organizations, the lesson is clear. Knowledge, calm resolve, and unwavering commitment to one's rights are far more potent than fear, and in standing firm, one not only preserves what is theirs, but can reshape the expectations, behaviors, and respect of an entire community, leaving a legacy that is both protective and transformative, a reminder that justice and autonomy are not given, they are asserted, defended, and, when necessary, enforced, leaving the final thought hanging in the air like a quiet challenge in a world of overreach. Who else is ready to stand and make the powerful pay the price of their arrogance?